Welcome to the Chiltern Teaching School Hub mentor session. So this is looking at EAL from the aspect of mentors and how you can support ECTs. We are very, very grateful that we've got Caroline and Sheila from the Bell Foundation, and they're going to take you through some sessions today and some chances for you to have some discussion and some ideas. So please get involved. When we go into breakout rooms, please put your cameras on. In fact, if you could turn your cameras on now, that would be nice for Sheila and Caroline, because otherwise they're talking to blank pages. Please get involved in the chat function, ask the questions, and gain as much information, because these ladies have an absolute wealth of knowledge. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline and Sheila. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Carol. Right, I'm going to share my slides. Thank you so much for inviting us, and we're really excited about this session, because it marks the start of like a partnership with Chiltern Teaching School. So yes, it's really nice. I mean, I'm hoping more people join, I'll be honest, but I am really delighted that we're getting a start off with mentors. So thank you so much. I'm just going to tell you a tiny little bit about the work that we're doing with Chiltern Teaching School, just to give you a little bit of context. So we're from the Bell Foundation, and it's a charity which works to overcome disadvantage through language education. And while we've got different strands involved in our work, the main focus is our EAL programme, which is largely directed at schools and at organisations that work with schools and learners. So we've got a national programme of courses, guidance, research, free webinars, and you can find all of that on our website. However, we know that a local offer that takes into account the local expertise, the local context, is by far more impactful. And so we've got a number of centres around the country. They're called centres of expertise, and they're established in different areas. And we're really delighted that Chiltern Teaching School Hub is now one of those. So this is literally the first thing that we've done with Chiltern Teaching School, so I'm really pleased. And you can see from our programme's objectives that our aim is to increase capacity through our centres of expertise, so that that we can have greater impact than the national offer might provide. So a number of people through Chiltern have applied to become what we call Bell Foundation licensed practitioners, and they're starting their training in just 2 weeks actually. And they'll be licensed to deliver training across the schools with Chiltern. So, and I'm flagging this now just so that it might be something that you might want to find out more about in the next few months. Or maybe you're interested in training to be a BFLP yourself if you're interested in EAL. But certainly in terms of like looking at what could be available for your school in the future. So that's why I'm just telling you a little bit about it now. So very quickly, the training loosely falls into 3 areas. First, a needs assessment, then CPD, and finally resources. And the CPD is probably the area that most schools will be most interested in. It can be quite flexible, but it's essentially drawn from what was originally a whole school model, which I'll just show you in a second. And that whole school model was originally designed to last over a number of years, so to meet different needs throughout the school. Or it can be an on-demand training, for example, one-off sessions, or the last one that you can see in that central box is ITT. And so we've developed 2 modules so far, which Sheila's going to go on and talk to you about, on ITT, and we're getting a lot of interest in that. So that's definitely, really key to our work at the moment. So really quickly, as I mentioned then, the courses that we've developed that are part of the training package that the BFLPs, the Bell Foundation licensed practitioners, will be able to deliver. This is an overview of some of it. So it's the idea that they're developed to meet the CPD needs of the whole staff, from senior leaders all the way through to non-teaching staff. But always at the heart of all of the training are the learners who are using English as an additional language. So the courses are all evidence informed. They draw on current data and research, and they offer practical strategies for the classroom. So I'm just telling you all about that now, so that you can keep an eye out for any involvement with Bell Foundation that you might hear about, and that you'll be able to ask questions in your schools and beyond. And hopefully those BFLPs will be visible, supporting schools to ensure that their offer for learners using EAL is the best it can be. But enough of that for now. So let's move on to this session. So in this session, we are going to look at why it's important to introduce an explicit focus on EAL in early career mentoring plans, activities and materials, how you can support your early careers teachers to adapt their teaching with English as an additional language in mind. We're going to look at some examples of mentoring materials and activities with a focus on EAL, so that early careers teachers can create an inclusive and conducive environment to enable pupils who are using English as an additional language to thrive at school, to learn and to achieve. So let's hope this works, because I've just cobbled this together really quickly, this activity. So a few facts and figures. Let's see. So all you're going to do is in the chat box, if you can put A, B or C when each question comes up, that would be great. Thank you. So the first one, how many pupils are in England are recorded as having a first language known or believed to be other than English?
So we have, someone says A and someone says B. There was a change of mind from C to A. So at the moment, the general is going for A or B.
Okie dokie. Next question. What is the share of teachers working in English schools with multilingual settings? So do 21% of teachers work in schools with multilingual settings, 31% or 41%? Any consensus there?
B or C.
B or C?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And finally, you probably all know this one. How many times is EAL mentioned in the ECF? Any consensus on that one?
We're going with B this time.
Oh, well, you might be in for a surprise then in that case. Okay, let's crack on then. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Cheryl. So the first one. So the right answer then is B. According to the official definition of EAL, this is how many, I'm not going to read the number out, how many learners there are who are identified as using English as an additional language, and that's taken from the 2021 census. And we know that they're unevenly distributed in different regions and local authorities and schools. I mean, obviously don't know what schools you're from, so I had a little look at the census earlier. And out of the areas, so I've got them all written down actually, but the one that really stood out to me in your area was Luton. So 51.8% of learners in Luton schools use English as an additional language. So I thought that was interesting. So given that almost 1 in 5 of our pupils are using English as an additional language, there clearly is a real need to consider this group in schools' policies, provision and practices. But regardless of numbers, even if it's only a small proportion of our learners, it's also important to focus on the needs of this group and of each individual child to make sure that our provision and the practices that we use are fully inclusive. So the next question was the share of teachers working in schools with multilingual settings. So in 2018, 41% of teachers were working in multilingual settings. Now, I'm assuming it's increased since then, but there isn't actually that statistic available since 2018. The data hasn't been submitted to that particular survey since then. So we'll go with 41% now. And shockingly, there are no mentions of English as an additional language in the early career framework. And given that we've just seen how many of our pupils are using English as an additional language, and given that almost half of teachers are teaching pupils in those diverse backgrounds, it really is quite shocking that EAL isn't even mentioned. So we've got a really logical structure to the training today. So we're going to look first at why we're focusing on EAL with early careers teachers, and why it's so important, not just to give it a quick nod, but to really embed it in professional development. And there's a strong chance, by the very fact that you're here today, that you already know why it's so important. So we won't dwell on it, but it is good to have those foundations, perhaps they're more applicable broadly in terms of CPD in your own schools. And we'll look at EAL and the early career framework, and how to approach EAL with early career teachers. And then finally, if there is any time, we will take questions. So first, we'll look at the reasons why, and there's many reasons why it's vital for early careers teachers to learn more about these plurilingual learners. And how best to support their education. The first is the numbers that we've just looked at show that in many areas of the UK, ethno-linguistic diversity and EAL can now be fairly regarded as ordinary and permanent features of schooling education. And the second reason is that the 2010 Equality Act, along with the Public Sector Equality Duty, requires schools to respond to diversity by removing barriers, discrimination and forms of exclusion for marginalised groups, and to ensure equitable learning and the fostering of good relations amongst all. And another reason is quite simply because we have to. The national curriculum emphasises the responsibility of subject teachers in mainstream schools to support the development of language. We've got the teacher standards. We know that it's quite clear that according to the teacher standards, every teacher should learn that, have a clear understanding of the needs of all pupils, including those with English as an additional language. And although it says about the being able to use and evaluate the distinctive teaching approaches, it's never made clear what those distinctive teaching approaches are. So there's almost a gap there in terms of what that will be. And we know that ITT is inconsistent when it comes to EAL, as Robert Sharples discusses in his recent book. So EAL can sometimes be lumped together generically with inclusion or SEND. And the programme offered during ITT often depends on the expertise available, either at a school level or local authority level. And that's one of the reasons why we're so keen to develop the capacity in centres of expertise through using BFLPs. And it obviously means that the provision at school level or at university level is really inconsistent for new teachers. So it's been argued that the lack of teacher knowledge in relation to EAL pedagogy often results in discriminatory practices for plurilingual learners. And this resonates with research conducted by Yvonne Foley, which found that early career teachers are aware that they need a broader knowledge base that would allow them to meet the needs of a diverse range of learners more effectively. And the early career teachers involved in the study also recognise that the increasing responsibility they face in meeting such needs impacts on their confidence as professionals. So they talked about feeling de-skilled and that they were applying pedagogies for working in monolingual English-speaking classrooms to multicultural, multilingual classrooms. And so ensuring that early career teachers learn to meet the needs of pupils using English as an additional language from diverse backgrounds during their induction programme. It's really, really important. So that their teaching is fully reflective of diversity, equity and inclusion. And then in the annual survey published by the DFE in 2018, NQTs reported that they feel less well prepared for EAL than for any other aspect of their work. So you can just about read that it says at the bottom right hand corner, teach EAL pupils 39%. So only 39% of NQTs gave a score out of 7 to 10 in terms of feeling prepared for a specific aspect of teaching. So in this case, for meeting the needs of English as an additional language learners. And so this is why it's so important to equip and enable early career teachers to deploy inclusive pedagogies effectively. Because without the most appropriate training, there's always the risk that generic inclusive strategies will not be effective for this specific group of learners whose learning sort of need is quite often solely English language. It's quite often no other need at all. And just a very, very quick mention then that obviously the early career framework that is being rolled out at a really difficult time, and the extraordinary disruption caused by the pandemic has adversely affected the teachers who were trained to teach. So over the last 2 years, many learners using EAL have been particularly affected because not only have they had learning loss, they've also had language learning loss. And we meet with schools regularly, we meet with teachers regularly, and they're still telling us now about the slower sort of catch-up rates for many of their learners. Particularly those who are at the earlier stages of English language acquisition. And it's obvious, of course, that those learners didn't have those opportunities to hear, speak or read as much English during the various periods of home learning. And that limited exposure to English may account for the current struggles that they're having, that some are having in school. And we're also well aware of difficulties in terms of staffing, so thinking as well about like where support staff might have been invited into classrooms to support learners who are using English as an additional language. They're often being used elsewhere now, so there's less support going into classrooms. So, and then finally, you'll all know, as part of Operation Warm Welcome, so the government's making at least £12 million available to prioritise additional school places for children arriving from Afghanistan. And that the intention there is to provide, among other things, specialist teachers and English language support to assist with the learning. And we know that many of the learners in that group haven't settled yet in that. They're probably still, there's a considerable number in temporary housing. And so moving schools will be another form of upheaval. And that's why it's even more important to ensure that schools are offering that consistency in terms of a quality approach to meeting the needs of learners using English as an additional language. And so that's bringing us on to look quickly then at English as an additional language in the early career framework. So everybody here already knows that the ECF was designed around how to support all pupils to succeed and seeks to widen access for all, and that it doesn't detail approaches specific to particular groups or additional needs. And that, of course, we know that that was a deliberate design move to emphasise the the importance of high quality teaching. But I want to make a quick comparison here with the ITT core content framework, because as with the ECF, the ITT core content framework is deliberately designed to emphasise the importance of high quality teaching too. And that is important for disadvantaged pupils and those with additional needs. So again, reflecting the importance of quality first teaching. But if we look at a quote from Jean Conte during a webinar on the rollout of the ITT core content framework, and she sees this, she says that it can be seen as a positive opportunity. And so I'll just give you a second to look at that quote from her. So it is that idea that it's normalising EAL teaching and the teaching of learners who are using EAL. And I think this is obviously still true of the ECF just as much as it is of the ITT core content framework. However, there's a flip side to this argument, and that is namely the risk that the distinctive approaches that may be required to support the most disadvantaged learners within this group, that they're absent from the ECF, that they may end up being overlooked and excluded from early career induction programmes. If we think of that they're perhaps based on a well-meaning, inclusive focus on quality learning for all, it means that it's flattening out these very, very specific needs of the learners who are using English as an additional language, so the focus being on language. And then in terms of assessment, as you obviously know, early career teachers aren't expected to collect evidence against the ECF. They'll continue to be assessed against the teacher standards only. And as we've said, the ECF states very general content and doesn't relate to any group of pupils, while the teachers' standards against which the early career teachers will continue to be assessed, that expects teachers to use and evaluate distinctive teaching approaches. And so that's where this session and the important role that you're going to play as mentors and tutors, that's where this comes into play, how we can bridge this gap. So I am going to hand you over to Sheila now, and she will explore this further.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Well, nice to be with you all, and thank you, Carolyn, for giving us kind of a context of which to work from today. As Carolyn obviously just mentioned to us, it's vital in many ways that we really do think about how we can work with our early career teachers to have them, learn about or learn more about how to support our bilingual learners. And so this section that we're going to go into now is how to approach EAL with early career teachers in mind. And I also wanted to just mention before we dive in here, I think Cheryl just shared something with you in the chat box. It was a document, a handout that we're going to be using in our breakout rooms. We've got 3 breakout rooms in this section that you guys will be working together on some mentoring materials and that type of thing. So hopefully you can just download that on the chat box if you need a copy at this point. Okay, so let's dive in. And as Carolyn mentioned, there was that report of Foley that talked about EAL. This is an ITE programming, but at that report, they recommended an approach to incorporating EAL into their programming. And they talked about the importance of having a dual approach to incorporating EAL content into what we do. And we suggest that this type of approach is also really appropriate for early career teacher programming and with mentors and that type of thing as well. And within that, they talk about the first part of that dual approach being having a number of core EAL sessions to give a grounding knowledge about EAL strategies and that type of thing. And then for the second, this is where the bulk of input and requirements for reflection and action and everything is infused throughout subjects and across all core concerns of the program. So when you're talking about adapting teaching or feedback or assessment, that type of thing, you're bringing EAL from the lens of EAL. Okay, and in this regard, the focus then is on making all lessons accessible rather than treating EAL as a bolt-on addition or something that we just do for one of our sessions and cover EAL kind of thing. So we do recommend this to be kind of an approach that you also will take in terms of mentoring early career teachers. Okay, so the first part of the dual approach is providing that the grounding knowledge. As Carolyn mentioned before, not all teachers, can we assume the new career teachers are going to be having perhaps a background in this or having it included in their ITE program. And to be fair, maybe even some really long-term teachers might not have had this kind of knowledge, or even you as mentors having the opportunities to have training or experience working within multilingual settings. So if that is the case, then we do suggest that one possibility for you is to familiarize yourself with some of the ITT modules that Carolyn mentioned earlier. Not that you would be teaching these or providing these necessarily to your mentees, but if you want to have some basic background information on this, these are good resources to go to either download materials or to kind of get a sense of this for yourself. The first module is on understanding EAL. The second one is on language for learning. Both of these are out at this time. And then the third one is going to be on assessment, and that will be coming out later this year. Okay, so these are things that you can download, where you just email go to this site here, to the Bell Foundation, and you can get them and access them through our website there. Okay. But the second part of this dual approach is where we actually are incorporating EAL into all of the programming that we do. And that's what we're going to be spending now the next remainder of this webinar and program on. Okay, so to do that, how do we do that, I guess? And that is something that the fact that EAL is conspicuously absent from the ECF, as Carolyn just mentioned, means that program designers and mentors, as yourself, will really need to look at that framework and interrogate it through a lens of EAL. Okay, we'll need to consider how we can supplement it with our reflections, our discussions and actions in order to support early career teachers in working with bilingual learners. Okay, so as we critically examine the statements in the ECF, right, we need to first go beyond the obvious place for EAL, which is in Standard 5, Adapting Teaching. And what we really need to do is to be looking at all 8 standard sections and ask this critical, well, ask and answer this critical question. So what does it mean for learners using EAL, especially for those at risk of underachieving? Okay, so kind of looking at each statement within the ECF from this question. All right. So to do this, let's look at an example of what this might actually look like if we interrogate those statements from that perspective. So in Standard 4, for example, classroom practice, there is a statement there that says, guides, scaffolds, and worked examples can help pupils apply new ideas, but they should be gradually removed as pupil expertise increases. Okay, so if we want to look at that from an EAL perspective, what would that look like? It could look like something like this, where we are saying that these guides and scaffolds and work examples can help pupils acquiring EAL learn and use the language they need, right, to demonstrate learning. And they should be gradually removed as pupils' proficiency in English increases. Okay, so it's really taking that general statement, 4.4, and looking at it through a different lens, through our learners using EAL. Okay, so it's the same type of thing, but just looking at it for what that means for learners using EAL. Okay, and you can do this through guided discovery tasks, speaking and writing frames, substitution tables, word mats and fans, all of these different types of ways that you can actually scaffold and guide learners using EAL. Okay, so that's the way of looking at those statements. And I'm wanting to set you up now for your first breakout room. You've been listening to us quite a bit. And I want to give you a chance. I think there's 3 in the breakout room here, but I would like to give you a chance to look at 3 more statements from the early career framework and take them from a lens of EAL. There'll be some questions for each one of these statements that will help guide you in that discussion. And then we will come back. You have about 8 minutes to do this. And so just have a conversation. How would these statements change if you were looking at them from an EAL perspective? Okay, so just have a discussion on that. But yeah, okay, so let's look at this then. I would have, I don't know, the handout. That's what's, unfortunately for me, I don't have that up right now, the breakout room handout. So Carolyn has it there. The effective assessment. Effective assessment is critical to teaching because it provides teachers with information about pupils' understanding and needs. So what is effective assessment? If we're thinking of effective assessment through the lens of EAL, what would that look like? What do we mean by effective assessment for EAL learners?
It's just acknowledging that their understanding, isn't it, really? Mm-hmm. It's assessing their level of understanding. Because obviously if they've got that barrier to learning through the lack of understanding, so it's I would say it's focusing on that level of understanding. That's what you need to assess first of all. Don't know if you'd agree.
Yeah, I think it's important for teachers to recognise what they're assessing in terms of subject knowledge and the barriers that doing so through the media of English presents there. So you might have the Einstein sitting in the room is more knowledgeable than everyone, but can't access the assessment or communicate answers due to the barrier of language. So the effective assessment should take into consideration those barriers and try and overcome them.
Yeah.
So have you seen that Vicky has put a comment in the chat as well, saying that we've had a number of Afghan refugees join our school, so we're finding assessment difficult. They all seem to have different language backgrounds.
Right. So exactly. And I think what you are talking about here too, and I'll maybe go towards the feedback slide for this one, and then we can come back to the well, I think that might be the best way to do it. I'm not quite sure, but so yes, what you are saying to assess for that language. I mean, if you're thinking of EAL, effective assessment, right? Actually does assess their proficiency in English. We need to know that. We need to know kind of where a lot of our learners using EAL, are they very new to English? Are they developing it? Are they quite fluent, perhaps, at this point in English? So that's what we mean by effective assessment, to assess their reading and writing skills, perhaps in their home language, which Vicky might be as tricky too, because if they're coming from a lot of different language backgrounds, that might be difficult to do, but it depends on, you know, how you can possibly assess in their home language, or to have those conversations with parents and the students themselves in terms of their literacy skills, if they are brand new to English in their first language. It also might mean to consider how pupils at different levels of proficiency in English can actually show evidence of their learning, that in ways that do not disadvantage them, because many learners might have the knowledge, right? But they might not be able to show that knowledge because to demonstrate that in English, as you were saying, I think, Paul, in terms of the barriers of some of the language skills. And then for pupils who are new to English and at the early stage of language acquisition, some of the assessment methods should elicit knowledge that don't rely so heavily on text and extended production. So in terms of, you can do things instead, like with graphs or with labeling or matching or sorting, that type of thing. So that's what we really are thinking of then. And from a language learner perspective, these are the kinds of things that we're thinking of for standard 6.1. The effective assessment is, assessing their language. Does that make sense? In some ways. Any other comments about that?
So Sheila, Vicky has put on the chat that her learners have access to Chromebooks. So we get them to translate the assessment, but it takes time. So they could assess them on less content. And I think, so is it okay if I just chip in with a point here from, say, last year when we did, when we were looking at the teacher assessed grades, one of the pieces of advice we were giving to schools was to look at exactly that, at how to reduce the language demands of the assessments and to make the assessments accessible so that the learners would understand exactly what they needed to do and what they needed to demonstrate. So it's more about the understanding of the concepts and less about the language that they didn't necessarily have a full grasp of. So it is getting that balance between the content and the language, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to think of other ways besides just text, right? Of being able to see, for them to be able to show what they know, or even to show what they know, perhaps even in their home language, if there's opportunity for that as well. Okay, fantastic. Let's move on for the sake of time here. The next one, 2.2, is prior knowledge plays an important role in how pupils learn. That is the statement from Standard 2. And Carolyn, could you read the two questions that go along with that?
Yes, I can. So, what constitutes prior knowledge for learners using English as an additional language? So that's a really important point. And what additional information might teachers need to gather to find out about multilingual learners' prior knowledge?
Pop them in the chat box as well in case anyone wants to go back over the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so what constitutes prior knowledge, right? And what can teachers do to learn about that prior knowledge? What are some ideas there? And I'm going to kind of go back and forth with my PowerPoint here.
Literacy levels in the first language is always important. If a learner isn't literate in their first language, then on the one hand, you could say, well, it's a fresh start on something new, but on the other hand, you're really saying, well, those skills of decoding, for instance, and writing and reading, haven't been worked on in the other language first. The knowledge of grammar and so forth. So you need that as in the context of it as. And I think that's what I was saying there.
Exactly, the prior knowledge that they would have, if I understand that correctly too, of their first language in some ways, right? Any other ideas of what constitutes prior knowledge?
I suppose as well the culture.
Okay.
Some of the learners, for instance, in my that I have, their language at home is not English, but they're born and raised in Scotland. So they have a kind of cultural knowledge in terms of cultural reference that perhaps coming from a different country to Scotland, that's not going to be there.
Right, exactly. And Vicki, excuse me, Vicki also adds previous experiences similarly to culturally, cultural kinds of understandings, but then also previous experiences, as you say, and from very rich experiences that will come with a lot of students too, but could be very varied from what we might assume learners who have just been within the English or the UK school system might have too. So I think anybody else have anything else to add, or?
I was going to talk about previous experiences as well. That's what I was going to mention, sort of finding out, what they have done previously, what they have learned about previously as well.
Exactly, and how and ways of trying to figure that out. So I don't know if I have anything more to share with all of you wonderful ideas here, but yeah, I do. What we, prior knowledge. It's important to recognize that that learners coming to us, even if they're newly arrived and with very little English, have an awful lot of prior knowledge, right? That we might not be able to access or to see right away because of, as you say, the language barrier. But I think perhaps the prior knowledge of a learner's first or other languages is hugely important, and it's a huge resource in terms of how they can use that to develop, the second language, or to develop their English here too, and to use it to also use their first language wherever you can, to help them to build not only on their language itself, but to maybe develop some of the prior knowledge that we would like to teach before they actually start into reading or writing on a topic. They can use their first language to learn some other, to read things, or to have maybe on the online there's some text that they can read in their first language, or to talk with their parents about it, or to, if there's another learner in the classroom that shares the same language, to have that opportunity to work together to kind of come up with some building background as well. Okay, and as you were saying, Diane, what the learners come to, maybe they have already learned a lot of the content, right? And so that's again something that we would want to try to determine. Maybe they've covered this material already, in their previous schooling, or maybe not. So it really depends on that. And then again, as you were saying, Paul, it can be quite different from one culture to another, and we can't just assume that everybody has similar kinds of prior knowledge as they come to the table. So very good. Okay, last one. I'm going to try to move on a little bit quickly here, but standard 3.5. So if you are doing a session with your mentee, you're looking at standard 3.5 now, and it says explicitly teaching pupils the knowledge and skills they need to succeed within particular subject areas is beneficial. So absolutely it is. It's very general. I think we all know that. But explicitly teaching pupils the knowledge and skills they need. Okay, so let's put on the EAL perspective on that. What constitutes the knowledge and skills they need to succeed within a particular subject area? What does that look like for a learner who is using EAL?
I suppose the obvious one is the kind of vocabulary and academic language that goes along with, but also the kind of genres of expected, for instance, of writing. So if in science, then they need to write in a scientific method with all the passive tenses and so forth that go hand in hand with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vicki adds that the GCSE students also need specialization knowledge or vocabulary. Again, the language vocabulary, not just the knowledge of the concepts and the content and that type of thing, right? So I'm going to keep moving on here because I think we're getting this idea now of an EAL perspective. But yes, the knowledge and skills to use the English language. I mean, that's part of it. It's not just the topic or the concept or the content, but also the language, which is required to access that within English, which is the medium of instruction. Okay, they'll need the instructional supports and strategies for language development, access to good models of English, explicitly teaching the language of math, the language of science, the language of history, as you said, the specification vocabulary, and explicitly teaching, as you were saying, Paul, the grammar and discourse at the sentence and text level for this, right? So it adds another layer, or it makes this very general statement a little bit more explicit in terms of what we really mean or what teachers really need to do with this, okay? So very good. Well done, everyone. We're going to move on to now thinking about how do we infuse EAL now, not just within thinking about the statements in the early career framework, but how do we move this into your mentoring materials? Okay. And in order to do this, we're going to just think of some really low prep tweaks. We all know you're incredibly busy, so we're not talking about creating new materials and all of that type of thing, but just some ideas of how to infuse this within your EAL mentoring materials, okay? And to do that, we've actually asked Chiltern to send us your mentor handbook so that we could somehow connect it to what is being asked of you. And there are two areas in the handbook that we're going to look at for the purpose of this presentation. Okay, the first area has to do with guidance for mentors as you are running these weekly sessions, okay? And there's two elements of that. There's the module audits that your mentees will be, you might already know this, but they'll be participating in module audits. And then it also looks at how you set up the structure of your weekly sessions. Okay, so we'll look at that. And then we're also going to look briefly at another section in the handbook that's just making the most of session elements. Okay, so those are our two areas that we're going to see how we can infuse EAL into. So the first one, let's talk about a little bit more of these module audits. So really quickly, I got this from the Early Career Teachers Handbook that I believe is also being used in Chiltern, because we were given both of these documents. So this is the overview, say, of program 1, the modules that your early career teachers will be going through during the year 1, right? And for each of the modules, they will be doing a module audit. And that means that the audit is a chance for your mentee to start looking at how the modules are connected to early career framework, and they're kind of thinking about their own confidence and competence within each of those early career frameworks as statements. Okay, so it's a chance for them to reflect on that and for you to have discussions with them in terms of where their strengths are and where they feel like they would like to focus more in terms of that. So we're suggesting that this is a perfect place, really, as you are looking at that early career framework with them and as they are reflecting on their confidence and competence in that, to bring up that question again. So what does this mean for learners using EAL, especially for those at risk of underachieving, right? So by bringing it up right away early on, this helps us to not just to treat language development and language learning as something that we do in a one-off session, but something that we do from the very beginning, thinking of it throughout all of these statements and our own practice, really. Okay, so so that's one place to look to infuse it. And the other one is during the sessions that you are going to be weekly doing with your mentee. And the handbook says that there are 4 different elements to this: reviewing last week's work, planning based on the audit, right? And then you're going to be doing some work with theory to practice, thinking about that's the self-study that they do, and you're getting helping them to put that into practice. And the last one is next steps of actually supporting them in terms of implementing some of this, okay? So for today, we're going to look at 3 areas of a typical session that you might have, where you will be doing things that you will be having conversations with your mentee, right? You'll have dialogue with them where you will have particular question prompts and possible feedback that are given to you. We don't have your specific session plans or sessions plans that you have. That I think it's on Canvas for you guys in Chiltern, but we're going to be looking more generically at this then, because you will have question prompts and possible feedback that are written into that. You'll have some suggestions of what to do, like questions that you might ask of your mentee in terms of if they're going to observe or discuss a particular practice, some guiding questions, and then you'll also be having some ideas in terms of suggestions that you would make to a mentee to prepare to put it into practice. Okay, so these are kind of elements that you'll be doing as a mentor. Okay, so what does this look like? This is a generic mentoring plan, but let's look at this a bit more carefully to think about infusing EAL into this. Okay, so this particular one, this weekly session is looking at Standard 4 and specifically considering the factors that will support effective collaborative or paired work. Okay, familiarity with routines, whether pupils have the necessary prior knowledge, and how pupils are grouped. Okay, so that's what we're looking at this particular week, okay, with your mentee. So I'm going to have you read this quietly, because this is what you might find in your mentor material to set this weekly session up. So this is for the dialogue. So I'll let you read it. Okay, so you will have that, and you will also probably be given something, possible feedback, ideas of what you might want to speak to your mentee with. So let's have a minute to read that as well. Okay, so again, great ideas for this, right? This is something that you will be having in your plans, great ideas. And now though, let's think of it again through that EAL lens. Is there any other feedback that could be given to your mentees about ways to support effective group work, but now in relation to learners who use EAL? So we've already, from the mentor materials, we know, to set out some success criteria, to teach them how to work in a group, right? To give groups feedback on how well they're doing. So what else could you possibly tell your mentee if we're thinking about group work that includes EAL, specifically perhaps those that are fairly new to English? Could there be any other things that we could offer in terms of feedback for our mentees to think about?
I suppose one thing is to consider, ask them about did they take into the consideration the language of the pupils in the groups? So was it possible, for instance, to pair someone who's new to English with another speaker of their first language, or to place them with a specific pupil who would perhaps be more talented is the wrong word, but more capable or have the capacity to kind of explain what was being said in a different way, etc.
Both are very good. I mean, both of those are great ideas for, in terms of thinking about how to pair your groups and that type of thing. Anything else from Vicki, Diane? Any other ideas on this? Diane, did you unmute?
Yeah, I was just to say, we're actually a forest school, so when I work with my mentee, we do an awful lot of work outdoors, and we take a lot of the curriculum outside. So we adapt a lot of what we do to outdoor learning. So it's very visual and it's very kinesthetic because it's very hands-on. So I think it's thinking just about making those adaptations, isn't it? And like Paul said, making sure that potentially you could pair them up with somebody that is more able and has a wider vocabulary that they could probably try and sort of share with the child with EAL. It's just trying to think about how you adapt the learning for that individual child and what they can access.
Right. I think that's whether you're doing that outside or bringing that inside is a really good way to think of it. So yes, so again, and this is what we have, some ideas as well for pupils who are new to English or at the early acquisition stage, thinking about providing maybe some sentence frames, right, to support sentence construction, some scaffolds for language. Maybe provide some vocabulary maps, right? Something that they could refer to, group together. And Paul, you were saying this, learners who share a first home language. So they have that support so that they can, rely on each other at sometimes too for comprehension and understanding. Or to group bilingual learners with learners who provide good models of English, that's what you were saying as well. And to provide multiple opportunities for modes of communication, use of visuals or use of computer translation tools, that type of thing, hands-on things. And as you say, Diane, everything outside, it allows for this, but to try to bring a lot of this inside as well. So all of these things are good ideas to bring to the table for your early career teachers in regards to what would be helpful for EAL learners within group work as well. Okay. Okay, so the next one that we're going to look at is suggestions. Again, this is from a generic mentoring plan. This is when you're going to be talking about suggestions for finding out what this looks like in practice. So I'll let you read this really briefly. Okay, so that's what you might do in activity. And then your materials might give you some ideas for questions to provide to your mentee in terms of, what kinds of questions they should be asking as they're doing the observation or the discussion. So we can read these too. Okay, so again, good ideas, and you're going to know my next question really, but is there another question that we could think about asking for learners or for our early career teachers? I'm sorry, if it's another question we could ask of them to look at when they're doing their observations or their discussions to consider in regards to EAL learners. Okay, so yes, how are the pupils grouped? What was the success criteria for the group work? How was the success criteria and instructions for the group work communicated? Were there roles for people? How did the teacher monitor the group work, right? And I'm going to do this one because I'm really just having you guys think about this. Our next one is really going to have you do it. But we thought for this one too, what additional supports or resources for the bilingual learners were there, right? That kind of goes back to what we were talking about first. Are there, vocabulary mats? Are they, what other additional resources, hands-on materials, or were there other kinds of multimodal things, bilingual dictionaries? Were there, the translation tools, that type of thing that could be needed? Okay, sentence frames and that type of thing. So it's good then too, as they are observing practice, to also think about the guiding questions as well, because these are the things you might need to add or to consider through that language lens as you set your early career teachers up in terms of this, in this regard. Okay, so that was to try to give you a sense of what it would look like. Our next breakout room, and I'm wondering about the time too, our next breakout room is, I was going to have you look at a standard yourselves, and to consider for this particular one, another session would be on standard 7, where it asks us to learn how to develop a positive, predictable, and safe environment for pupils by giving manageable, specific, and sequential instructions. Okay, so now we're in our weekly session and our mentee is looking on the idea or the practice of giving manageable, specific, and sequential instructions. Okay, and again, deliberately broad here, but what would that look like or mean for an EAL learner? What is manageable, specific, and sequential instructions for our EAL learners who are, perhaps newer to English? Okay, so I guess, and I was going to have you think of, and maybe this is a time we could just do it together, was to consider, would there be any additional feedback during a dialogue prompt? The first thing is, when we're giving feedback, when you're having a dialogue with your learner about manageable and specific and sequential instructions, what additional advice would you give to your mentee then in regards to doing this for our EAL pupils? I guess that would be the best way to ask it. What additional advice or feedback could you offer them to consider instructions as they are giving instructions for, if they have a group or a number of EAL pupils? What might be your feedback or advice?
Could they possibly try and do it visually rather than, if they haven't got the understanding of the language, they could use visuals to show the instructions, rather than written language. Just depends on their understanding, doesn't it?
Right. And visuals, maybe if pictures, or maybe just actually actually doing it somehow, whatever the instructions, to do it yourself, or to actually do what you're asking them to do first. I mean, to somehow get that visually communicated instead of just through verbal
text.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Vicky says having the instructions written down or modeling physically depends on the task. Exactly, because just as we might model or verbally say something, having it in writing, to capture it in writing, can also be really helpful as well, depending on that. Okay, go ahead, Paul.
I think also the language itself in the instructions, there's no point in using complex verb tenses, for instance, with a group who are still learning basic present tense, or putting something like before you do before the main instruction, and it's just going to throw off. So having that, make sure that's tailored to the levels and abilities of the pupils.
No, that's why you're all mentors, because these are great ideas. This is it, exactly. For pupils who are, who might be new or earlier acquisition stages, we're talking about what you were saying there, Paul, with that, the language of instructions might need to be graded, right? Depending on the level of proficiency of your learners. So using perhaps more simple grammar and vocabulary, using shorter sentences, with no more than like one instruction per sentence, speaking a little more slowly and clearly than you would normally do, pausing after each instruction to allow for processing time, writing a few key words, as Vicky was saying, on the board as you speak, can help with the listening, and then using gestures and facial expressions to support your instructions, or visuals, absolutely with that. And then for pupils who are more competent and fluent, that's when more spontaneous speech with a lot of additional verbiage would be more likely to be used. But I do think when you are working with learners using EAL, you become much more aware, or you should become much more aware too, of the language that you are using as well. Because that is something, even if it's recording yourself giving instructions or that type of thing, to actually hear yourself giving instructions for those learners. Okay, so suggestions for finding out what it might look like in practice then, if you're going to add an additional question as your mentees are observing a teacher or looking at you and how you are giving instructions or whatever. An additional question then might be, how does the teacher grade language, right? So for sure, giving them feedback, but then also then having them actually look for that type of thing within an observation. Okay, so incorporating EAL in, feedback that you're giving them, advice that you're giving them, and also questions to help guide their observations and that type of thing as well. Okay, so the other, so we're doing good here. I'm just wanting to check the time really quick. We're at 5:11. I think we're going to make it through this. Let's just give a quick recap up here of what we have done. We've looked at how both module audits and session structure, right? We've looked at how to give advice and feedback. We've looked at now how to kind of think of other questions as our mentees are observing things or watching videos of things and that type of thing. But now I'd like to have us look at the next portion of your handbook, which talks about making the most of session elements, okay? And we're going to look at suggestions for the mentee of how to prepare to put things in practice from an EAL perspective. Okay, so your handbook provides a lot of wonderful ideas for activities to do with your mentees as they are preparing to put things into practice. The session material might actually have lots of ideas for activities to use for this as well. Okay, and when we're going to look at the more of a generic kind of mentoring plan for this, but when you are looking at, again, statement 6.1 of effective assessment is critical to teaching because it provides teachers with information about pupils' understandings and needs, right? In your mentoring material, an activity might look like this, something like this, to select a pupil to reflect upon, right? Have the mentee practice identifying strategies that they could use to target this pupil and increase their progress. Okay, so again, wonderful activity to do, but somewhat general, right? But you are looking at a particular pupil to reflect upon, which is great. So if that pupil then happens to be a learner using EAL, multilingual learner, let's look at then how this might look like, how we can change this activity to bring in that perspective, okay? To make it a little bit more, not so general, but more specific to our learners. So here you might change it to select 2 pieces of writing from a bilingual learner, right? And examine them against the Bell Foundation assessment framework, right? To consider their level of English proficiency, okay? And then also to consider language targets for that pupil. And then you can collaboratively plan for the use of strategies that would support language development for the learner. Okay, so again, it's like taking that mentoring material from the general down to maybe a little bit more specific for our learners using EAL, just as an activity. Okay, not for everything, but at times this might be really helpful to bring in the perspective. So I guess the next one that I would like, the next final thing that I'd like us to do together really is to think of creating some activities, which you will hopefully be doing and bringing that EAL perspective into it. And to think about from the standard 7 now, we've looked at this earlier, learn how to develop a positive, predictable, and safe environment for pupils by giving manageable, specific, and sequential instructions. Okay, so we're back to instructions again, okay? The question is, or the task is, could you create an activity, perhaps, using a number of these activities that were provided here? What could the activity look like in regards to creating something with the perspective of an EAL learner? Is there anything, what would you have your mentee do in that regard? And again, we would be using a number of these. We don't, not just one, but yeah, any ideas would be great for this.
I think if it was me, I'd be advising my mentee to first of all observe a colleague, just to see an experienced teacher and how they, what type of activities they would do for an EAL child, and then get some ideas, and then ask them to actually go off themselves then and independently plan a lesson or a session or just an activity that then could include the EAL child, and then we could have that discussion afterwards about, you know, what they observed, what they learnt from what they observed, and then how they've put that into their own practice through independent planning. So I think for me, it would be, I would probably initially focus on that. But I think observing experienced teachers who are used to supporting children with EALs are really, really sort of I think it's a really beneficial thing to do for mentees.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. I mean, to actually do the observing, as we said, the kinds of the questions that you would guide them to ask as they are observing. And again, if it was specific to Standard 7, you would be actually having them observe primarily for how that teacher then is giving instructions, right, to the EAL learners, right? Exactly. That's a great thing to be able to have them do. Yeah, good. Any other ideas? Looking for Vicky here. Paul, we still have a few more hours of daylight, if we're still able to think anymore.
I suppose tying in with what Diane says, perhaps the touch of observe perhaps videos of a bad delivery, if like, as well as good, so that you can do the reverse and do the assessment, if you like, with the mentor, to see why that perhaps didn't go correctly or as planned, to avoid that pitfall.
Yeah, and again, that's kind of in that way of being able to come back then and both look at the instructions together, I think is what you were saying, and that's something that we kind of thought about too. I mean, all of these ideas are great, but the one that we have here is to actually look at a short script from a video together, mentor and mentee, and look at that instructions and then consider how is that graded, if you would change the instructions at all, in terms of grading it for your learners who might be fairly new to English. So an example, the instruction on the video is, I want you to open your books and to spend 10 minutes doing exercise 3 in silence. That's how it was given. But if you now look at this with your mentee and start thinking about, can we grade this somehow in a different way for some of our, our learners that really are fairly new, where we look back at that, simple, more simple language, where it's just one idea per sentence, pausing and that type of thing. So it turns into open your books, do exercise 3 in silence, right? And you have 10 minutes. Okay, so you're really studying that language, and then you might have them actually script for an upcoming lesson, kind of script maybe what they are going to say for their instructions, of how they are going to give their instructions, and to make it graded, or to be very aware of that, and then to have them practice that in an upcoming lesson as well, to actually provide that. Okay. So great ideas, all of you. Fantastic. We have just one last little section here on, you might be thinking to yourself now, like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of information and material and that type of thing that I might need to add into some of my mentoring sessions with our mentees. There's really no need, though, to reinvent the wheel for this. Okay, there's a lot of material out there. It might require you to think about maybe providing some handouts. You might want to think about doing some worksheets or giving some further reading materials on this, or links to materials to download and that type of thing. And there are lots of websites out there. I mean, the Bell Foundation you are aware of now because we are here, but NALDIC also is a great organization that has a wealth of information also for working with multilingual, plurilingual students and that type of thing as well. Don't also forget that you have people perhaps even in your own school, right? Like, who is the EAL coordinator or a member of staff who's accountable for EAL, and how they could help you, right? Maybe they could help you interrogate their early career framework from that EAL lens, or provide materials and guidances and resources for you, or to participate in a session with you, with your mentee, right? And they might also have external resources that they know about that they could offer you, okay? So whatever you can do to bring that in, and to know that you have that support and from both organizations and perhaps internally as well as externally as also. And I am going to turn it, I think at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Carolyn, who has a few more ideas on resources for you. But I will say goodbye today. And well, we both will, but it was really, you've got some wonderful ideas, and it's really hopeful when you do a webinar like this to hear from all the teachers out there, and to really appreciate and thank you for your work that you are doing so well. So I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
Oh, thanks, Sheila.
Yeah.
It's just following on from what Sheila said, really, about being able to signpost the student teachers that you're working with. So it's also a shameless plug. So we as part of the national offer that I mentioned, we do lots of free webinars. And actually, I didn't think to mention this, we have the recordings of all of the past webinars on our website. So, for example, last week we had, last week or the week before, we had an expert panel talking about welcoming refugees and asylum seekers. And a couple of weeks before that, we had Professor Lee Way talking about making the most of the languages, how community languages can support English language learning. And we've got the free webinars coming up on vocabulary. And we've also got 3-hour courses, which they run over sort of 3 to 4 weeks. So it's not 3 hours in one fell swoop. It's one module, then a webinar, and then an assignment. Sheila, can you move me on, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. And we thought we'd mention this as well. So one of the really popular areas on our website for the teachers is called our Great Ideas area. And there's a whole plethora, that's just a few of them, of strategies that are really effective when you're working with learners who are developing their English language proficiency. And all of these have little video. So, for example, Barrier Games has a little video on how to use this activity, this strategy, and some ideas about resources and so on. So they're really useful to share with student teachers. And we also have guidance pages, which you can see on the right-hand side. So I just screenshot the one on multilingual support, which is obviously much, much longer than that. And then you can see some of the other ones along the other side as well. So that's just a few ideas. And then there's also a document that Cheryl's already shared, which is on sort of research perhaps that you might find useful and your mentees might find useful and interesting as well. So it's where, we've sort of like scratched the surface or referenced things that you might want to go into in a bit more detail. I think that's us. That's us done. Any questions?
No questions, but just to say thanks very much for a fantastic webinar. Really learned a lot from that.
Oh, pleasure.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you very much. I've just registered with the Bell Foundation, so
I just saw that, Diane. That was quick.
Yeah, I'm just going to have a look at the assessment framework and see what other resources there are on there as well. So thanks very much.
And there are, I see that Cheryl's put them on the chat as well. There's 3 sessions coming up.
There's 3, sorry.
There's 3. I've written them down so I didn't forget. So there's 9th of March is. So these are sessions that are aimed at the early careers teachers themselves.
In Chiltern, it's specific to Chiltern, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So the first one's 9th of March, and that's an introduction. So we're looking at sort of like the factors affecting attainment and what an inclusive pedagogy looks like. The second one is on the 24th of March, and that's looking at comprehensible English. So that's more about like what she was talking about grading. And then the 26th of April is the language for learning. So bringing language into subject teaching. Shameless plug there for the courses that we're doing. So.
Please take them up on the brilliant stuff you've heard Caroline and Sheila talk about today is kind of just touching on the iceberg of what the Bell Foundation do. So you've got the session today. We've emailed all of your ECTs as well, but please do try and push them towards them, because as you've seen, the information you've gained today, it isn't part of the early career framework, but we all know just how important it is. I've put the link to our website where you can kind of join up for all these sessions. And as Caroline said at the beginning, we are kind of working into our partnership now, where we're going to be working really closely together. So if your schools are interested in things, please make sure you make contact with us or the Bell Foundation, and we'll support you wherever we can. But a massive thank you to Caroline and Sheila. Thank you for giving up your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you all.